Hi everyone! I have read some really good books recently, but I haven't reviewed them, so I'm going to talk about 5 books today and what I thought about them. In the order that I read them: Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. I think this is part 1 and 2. I've heard a lot about this book on BookTube, and ever since I've heard about it, I have been interested in reading it. It is an autobiography of Marjane's life from her childhood to her adolescence and then kind of her adulthood. And she has a really interesting story. She was the great-great-granddaughter of the last emperor of Iran, which I didn't know that. And then her 2 parents were very outspoken and radical in their political views against the political climate that she grew up in. And that is actually what I really liked about this book. I learned a lot about Iran's history and the politics and some of the conflict that has gone on. And I learned things that I had never known about. And I learned them in a very interesting and still entertaining way, because you are still hearing her story. One thing that I will add about this book is that the illustrations really add to the dialogue and the text. With a lot of graphic novels or memoirs, sometimes I feel like the illustrations are just in addition to the text and they don't do their own thing. They're not telling more to the story. But with this book, I felt like the illustrations really added a lot more to the story, and I really appreciated that. Overall, I loved this book. I really loved Marjane's voice, and hearing her story from herself, you can tell that she's a very observant person and that she has a lot to say about the things that have gone on in her life and the experiences that she had. So I really appreciated hearing her story in this book. I gave it 5 stars. I loved it. The second book that I read at the beginning of this summer, and it is Uglies by Scott Westerfeld. And my sister and I actually swapped books. She really wanted me to read this book because she had read it, and she read a book that I really like, so that we could talk about them. Now, this is a YA dystopian novel. How do I describe it? It is about a society where everyone is an ugly until they turn a certain age and undergo a plastic surgery that everyone in their society, almost everyone, undergoes to become pretty. And the protagonist in this novel is named Tally, and she's about to have her surgery, but things don't go as planned. She meets a friend who is opposed to the surgery, and then she's kind of swept away into questions about her society and learning secrets that she didn't know about. I thought it was very interesting. It kind of gave a lens to view through this made-up society and to look at our own society, because I think that there are cultural expectations of beauty, and some people do go through surgeries and different means to meet those expectations. In the beginning of the book, the author talks about a documentary that helped him and inspired him for this. So he was going off of real life things when he wrote this book. And I liked that aspect of this book. How it's looking at society and conformity, and if everyone is undergoing the surgery, and that's the norm, nobody wants to stick out, nobody wants to remain ugly for their whole lives. So I liked that. The one thing I will say about Scott Westerfeld's writing, and when I was reading reviews on Goodreads, I saw this in some other reviews, is that in scenes where he's having action sequences, the writing became less clear. It's like there was a change, and it was more difficult to actually understand what he was saying was happening. I think there were several moments that I was reading this where I just kind of didn't know what was happening, but I didn't really care, and I kept reading to get done with that scene. So for some reason the action scenes aren't written in a coherent way. I don't know. But it was an enjoyable read. I'm not sure if I'll go on to read the rest of the series. I might if it means a lot to my sister. It's a book that I have always been interested in, so I'm glad that I picked it up to see what it was all about. And another book that I listened to on audiobook is A Stranger in the Woods by Micheal Finkel. And ever since I heard about this book, I wanted to read it. It is about a man who, at the age of 20, I believe, just dropped out of society. And he lived as a recluse in the woods of Maine. And he did that for, I think, about 20 years. And this book is told by, I believe it's a journalist, who for some reason is outside of the journalist community because he did something wrong. I don't remember what it was. But he interviews this man named Christopher Knight, and he gathers the stories of his life and tries to figure out why he wanted to live alone in the woods for so long. And the story just fascinated me. I think recluses and people who have wanted to live outside of society has always been something that I found interesting. And you always have that question of why did they do it? Like, why did they want to be off on their own? And I think the book did a good job of answering that. And it also did a very good job of giving the reader a feel for what Christopher Knight is like and his personality, and you learn that he loved to read and that he would steal material and books and magazines so he could read them. I know that there was a lot of legal issues when he was finally found, because he was not living completely autonomously outside of society. He was stealing from people in order to survive. And so that's another interesting concept. He wasn't out there hunting, he was taking. And it was a really fascinating story. The author went into his campsite and he saw how it was set up, and I loved that book a lot. I gave it 4 stars. And then I read Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. And this is the first book that I have read by Anne Bronte, and it is about a woman named Agnes whose family is having financial problems, and so the solution that she finds is to become a governess. And she's the governess for a few families in this novel, and that's the gist of this book. I think that the very beginning of this book gives you a good sense of what it's all about. I'll just read the first sentence. It's a good first sentence. All true histories contain instruction, though in some the treasure may be hard to find, and when found, so trivial in quantity that the dry, shriveled kernel scarcely compensates for the trouble of cracking the nut. And I think that's the crux of what this book is. It's telling her story with some moral lessons and some things that she learned through her journey of being a governess. And that's most of the story. I will say, the first half of it, I really appreciated the writing. I loved the writing, but I didn't feel pulled by the story. There's not a lot of conflict until you meet the love interest, Mr. Weston. And then you're kind of engaged to see what's going to happen with that relationship. But I'm glad I read it because I did enjoy it. It's not my all-time favorite book, but it was a nice read. And there's a lot of good there's quotes every once in a while of just very insightful things that Anne Bronte has to say through the character of Agnes, and I did appreciate that a lot. So it was interesting, and now I'm very excited to read The Tenant of Wildfield Hall to compare another Anne Bronte work to this one. Okay, coffee break. And the more recent book that I read is Go Set a Watchman by Harper Lee. Now, this book has an interesting history. The manuscript of this book was the original manuscript of To Kill a Mockingbird, but the publishers originally did not like that, and Harper Lee rewrote it and reworked it, and that became the To Kill a Mockingbird that we know today. And this is either the original story or what came out of it. I'm not quite sure, but it was published a few years ago. And this story picks up about 10 or so years after To Kill a Mockingbird ends. And Scout is no longer called Scout by many people. She's now called Jean Louise, and she's grown up. And in this book, she returns to Macomb, Alabama, for a few days. As she returns, she's realized that things have changed. And that's most of this book. In this book, Jean Louise is becoming aware of the racial tension that's still present in Macomb and that has been changing. She's also becoming more aware of everyone's perspective on that tension. I appreciated how this book delves into that and how it explores the idea of when a child grows up and realizes that their parent, whom they may have idolized, is not perfect. And I think that's kind of what happens to Jean Louise, because everybody reads To Kill a Mockingbird and says that Atticus is just the greatest guy. And in this book, you see a picture of an Atticus that doesn't match the perfect epitome of a father as Scout portrays in To Kill a Mockingbird. And in this book, you're reading about how she's coming to terms with that. I appreciated it. I know that a lot of people did not like this book. They didn't like how it changes the perspective of Atticus. There's a lot of controversy about whether or not Harper Lee wanted this book to be published. So that's another aspect. She may have been not lucid when she signed the paper to publish it, so there's a mystery there, but I liked it, and I think that it did add something to the story of To Kill a Mockingbird, or it added to the discussion that To Kill a Mockingbird creates. So I'm very glad that I read it. I actually gave it 5 stars. Those are the books that I have read recently, and it's good. I gave, 2 of them 5 stars, 1 of them 4 stars, and 1 of them 3, so pretty good reading. Nothing that I hated, so that's good. I would love to hear what you've been reading recently, and if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear your opinion. So, as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!